Hello, welcome to today's weapon showcase. The concept of the tank destroyer was actually argued, argued during the interwar periods between World War I and World War II by a lot of different countries, and a lot of countries had proponents of the idea, as far as the tactical ideas as well as some design ideas. And we usually think of the most common ones: the Jagdpanzer for Germany, the M10 Wolverine for the U.S. Some of the British ones might even think of the Archer. But ironically, it wasn't the big three of any of the major powers that actually really brought the tank destroyer into being. It was a lot of the smaller countries. And today we're going to talk about the Polish tank destroyer and the odd way it came about. So stay tuned. Alright, so as I said before, the tank destroyer concept was the whole idea. It was theorized between the wars, and a lot of countries across the world had proponents, both in the tactical theory side as well as in the technical design side. But oddly, like I said, the major powers, Germany, France, Russia, U.S., Britain, none of them developed an actual weapon until 1940. That's the first entered into service. But oddly, the smaller nations actually developed the tank destroyer before World War II began. The Belgians in 1936 kind of went the route of building a tank destroyer, and theirs had a turret. It was a T-13. You can see the picture up here. A lot of these were actually built off of the famous Cardin-Lloyd tankette design, which remarkably spawned a lot of derivatives across many countries of different types of armored fighting vehicles at different times. But the Czechoslovakians actually, around the same time, were doing the same work, looking for a kind of a fixed forward position tankette with a nice 37mm tank gun, anti-tank gun, and they developed the SID, and they actually exhibited the first prototype in 1936 before the Belgians even started their investigation into the design. So the Czechs were actually the first ones out there, and they were actually presenting the SID to the Yugoslavian army, who were looking for a tank destroyer. A lot of these smaller countries knew they'd be facing armor based on what happened in World War I and the major powers having all these tanks. And they knew they didn't have the ability to develop these tanks themselves, so they figured a tank destroyer was the answer. The Poles, however, in 1936, they were starting their own journey toward the tank destroyer, but theirs took a slightly different twist because they didn't set out to develop a tank destroyer. Let's take a look at how the path of the Poles took to coming up with the first tank destroyer. Alright, so as I mentioned, the Poles kind of took their kind of different approach to the tank destroyer. They didn't even have it in mind when they were designing the weapons they're trying to put together. When the Cardin-Lloyd tankette was first put on the market, and the brochures even from the Cardin-Lloyd tankette had a 37mm gun at least in the brochure, mounted. It was never delivered that way or developed that way, but the Poles immediately were thinking self-propelled gun. So between the time the Cardin-Lloyd tankette came out and 1931, there was kind of trying to figure out how they could do this. Well, once 1931 came along and the TK3 was adopted as the Polish tankette, which was essentially a Polish design tankette based on the Cardin-Lloyd design, that is when the Polish army really started getting their act together and designing a self-propelled gun. Now, unfortunately, that is not a tank destroyer. That was essentially a light howitzer, a very light howitzer, mounted on an open-top tankette, and that was the TKS-D. That we'll cover that in a different video altogether. But that's not the tank destroyer. Instead, that was an infantry support self-propelled gun. Instead, in 1936, when the 37mm anti-tank gun made by Bofors was adopted by the Polish army, almost immediately the Polish were starting to look for a different way to haul the gun around. They had a C2P tractor, armored tractor, to haul the gun initially. That was the plan. But they wanted something different. They actually wanted, instead of having a tractor that would haul the carriage behind it with the complete gun, they decided instead they wanted an armored tractor where they could haul the ammunition trailer and carriage behind, but after they had dismounted the gun off the carriage and mounted it in the hull. It's kind of a strange approach, but the thinking at the time was, by the time they were going to move from one position to the next, they would have the gun mounted on the hull just in case they needed it. If they encountered the enemy, suddenly, they could actually fire that anti-tank gun effectively from the hull itself. Alright, so the basis for what would be the TKS-D was actually the C2P tractor we looked at before. That tractor was actually based on the TKS tankette, which was actually an improved version of the TK3 I mentioned earlier. The development began in February of 1936, only a couple of years after they first looked at this idea. And a prototype was ready in 1937. The prototype was actually ready by May of 1937, so a little over a year of development there. Let's take a look, because this design was very different from anything that was out there prior to this. So let's take a look at the hull design. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Alright, so for a tankette, the hull was actually rather long. It stretched almost the entire length of the vehicle, and this is a model of the very first prototype. And you'll notice that the armored sides went up to roughly the elbow height, shoulder height of the occupants. Originally, the design had crew space for 4, but it was eventually reduced to 3. You had the actual driver on the right, the gunner and loader on the left, and later in 1937, a second prototype would be delivered. This one differing very slightly by having the armored sides brought up to the level of that were in the front. So that would cover almost all the way up to the partway through the helmet. Now, there were some other changes into the front and the side and the rear, but essentially it was the same design, just with a slightly different hull. Alright, so in 1937 and 1938, both prototypes were at the training center in Modlin, Poland, to kind of go through some trials, not quite trials, but evaluation and testing, if you will. Well, somewhere during that time, I guess they realized that things working a little different than they expected. And since the gun could be fired effectively from the hull itself, there was really no point to having a gun carriage as well. So sometime between the time they were at the training center and eventually the exercises in 1938, someone decided to just leave the gun in place and don't worry about the carriage. And from that point on, you stop seeing these tankettes carrying the gun carriage. Now, some of them still had the ammo trailers they'll be carrying, but they were deployed without any gun carriage. Essentially, they became a tank destroyer sometime in 1938. At the training grounds, they proved themselves very well, because what happened in July of 1938 is they were actually assigned to the newly formed reconnaissance battalion of the 10th Cavalry Brigade and sent to the brigade's trials, or basically training exercises, in August and September. So at this point, these two prototypes were actually part of the 10th Cavalry Brigade, and they were used and tested in exercise scenarios to see how effective they would be, and must have honestly proven themselves pretty well, because though these were prototypes, both remained in the table of organization and equipment for the 10th Cavalry Brigade's reconnaissance battalion up until the start of the war. So these actually were put into service. Now, unfortunately, there are only 2 examples. The prototypes, though placed in service, would not see any production runs of these just tank destroyers. It turned out they were, again, the thought was they were looking for an artillery tractor, and these were much too expensive. So they were looking for another way. And so what they ended up doing is towing the 37mm anti-tank guns with this basically PZ-INZ 302 artillery tractor. So there will be no more tank destroyers built, but these tank destroyers, though not the first designed and introduced into service, would be the first to see combat. Alright, so in the early part of 1939, prior to the war, the Recon Battalion also included the 4 TKS-Ds, which are those are the self-propelled guns I mentioned earlier. But at some point, it seems that those actual units or self-propelled guns were actually taken out of the Recon Battalion's equipment list. But the TKS-Ds stayed. And on the 2nd of September 1939, when the 10th Cavalry Brigade was pushed into the line and was actually engaging the Germans for the first time, the TKS-Ds would be engaging the Germans. So what ended up happening, there's a lot of details are a little unclear simply because the chaos that occurred during that, but the Recon Battalion was in combat with the Germans throughout the first week or 2 weeks of 1939 September campaign. Now on the 5th, one of the prototypes, it's not clear which one, was actually destroyed due to some artillery fire. And the second wasn't finally destroyed until the 9th. So there, for several days, these 2 prototypes were actually in use in combat with the 10th Cavalry Brigade. So this brings me to kind of how to use in bolt action. Well, the models I showed you earlier are some designs I kind of created, sort of, or modified from an entry on Thingiverse, and I wanted to make one of each. And I used the kind of a fan-made vehicle point calculator that you can find different places on the internet to point cost these 2 prototypes. Now they're both identical. Essentially, they're a tankette with a 7+ armor with a light anti-tank gun mounted and forward-facing, and they are open top. They don't have recce because though they were part of the Recon Battalion, this is part of the anti-tank squadron for the Recon Battalion. So they're not really meant to be going forward, scouting for the enemy and then going back. Instead, when the enemy was found by the Recon Battalion, the 4 anti-tank guns and these 2 TKS-Ds would be deployed to engage any enemy armor that was found while the rest of the unit pulled back. So, in bolt action, these are 90-point self-propelled guns, essentially, and tank destroyers would be taking up your tank slot in your platoon selector. Now, you will be seeing these in the upcoming episodes of Clash of Heroes, and if you haven't seen that yet, you can go over to the Clash of Heroes playlist and kind of see that campaign unfold and watch these models in action. So thanks for sticking around. Share, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.